The world's hunger for energy is only getting bigger, with data centers springing up like mini cities, each consuming as much power as tens of thousands of homes. The challenge is clear. How do we deliver abundant, clean, and reliable energy? Nuclear power offers one of the few solutions that ticks all those boxes with near zero CO2 emissions and the ability to keep the lights on and the computers running 24/7. And in some ways, it feels like we can have our cake and eat it too. Which brings us neatly to our guest, the CEO of Yellow Cake PLC, a company that gives investors direct exposure to uranium, the fuel, of course, at the heart of nuclear energy. I'm Mobeen Tahir, Director of Macroeconomics and Thematic Research at WisdomTree. With me, a familiar voice and face, Chris Gannatti, Global Head of Research at WisdomTree. And we are joined by Yellow Cake's CEO, Andre Liebenberg. Andre, welcome to the show.
Mobeen, thanks very much. And it's a complicated surname that not many people get right. So well done. I get called all different versions, but Liebenberg's perfect. Well done.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And we are very happy to have you. It's a very interesting topic. But I know, Andre, you've seen many facets of the mining and resources industry yourself across different types of materials. Would love to hear a little bit about your own career journey. And personally, what is it like to be leading a uranium company at this point in time when it feels like we're experiencing perhaps a nuclear renaissance?
Yeah, Mobeen, I think, the last, we IPO'd in 2018. So the journey since then has been very exciting. But let me just touch sort of on my earlier career, as you asked. So I started life as an electrical engineer, and then in South Africa, and I still remember I was sort of 2 kilometers underground in a mine, ankle deep in mud with a screwdriver in my hand, and the Berlin Wall was coming down. And so I thought, my world's not really impacted by that. The external world's changing. So I quit that job, and then went and did an MBA. And from that, I got into the financial services industry, investment banking in South Africa. And then I was offered a role with UBS in London. And that was back in 97. And we then, shortly after I joined, got the mandate to take a South African conglomerate, split it up and take the base metals assets into London, and list the company there. And that was the listing of Billiton PLC back in 1997. We raised $1.5 billion, which was the biggest equity raise for a South African or a mining company. And it was also the first externalization of a South African mining business. So I was with BHP for 15 years. I was in London, I was in Melbourne, Sydney, back to London, and left them in 2012. When we were in Sydney, we sort of wanted to come back to the UK for schooling, kids' schooling purposes. After that, I joined a private equity firm in the mining space. We bought a gold asset from AngloGold Ashanti. It was a private equity firm backed by the Qataris and a Polish wealth office. In 2015, the financiers decided they didn't want to grow the business, so they kept the mine, but really shut down the whole business development function. And it was shortly after that I got back in contact with someone that I'd known back from 2007 in my BHP Billiton days. We bought a mining business in Australia called WMC. WMC was had a very large copper mine called Olympic Dam, but it was also the world's single largest uranium deposit. So that was kind of my first exposure to uranium. And then in 2017, we started working on the concept of Yellow Cake and putting that together. And in 2018, we IPO'd. And you talked about how, the journey, back in 2018, when we went to see investors, it was like, it was a very bespoke entity. Nuclear and uranium was almost never mentioned. And it was almost, I felt like we had these clandestine meetings. And I was surprised. There were a lot of investors at that stage who, when you spoke to, said, yeah, we understand the story, we get it. And it, was a kind of a huge positive surprise. So we IPO'd in 2018, raised $200 million, bought our first 8 million pounds of uranium at a price of $21 a pound. And it kind of the market moved along, and it was really in 2020 when uranium and nuclear got much bigger exposure, and that really was on the back of COVID. Cameco had shut in MacArthur River; that was under care and maintenance, and when COVID hit, their other big operating mine, Cigar Lake, was impacted, and production there was shuttered for a while. Uh, so if you look at the world's uranium production, Kazakhstan, Canada, Namibia, and Australia produce about 75% of the world's uranium, and pretty much all of those countries were impacted by COVID. So you saw in 2020 the uranium price rocket. The only other commodity price that went up at the time was gold. And I think when you saw commodity prices fall, but a couple of prices go up, that caught attention, particularly with retail investors. And then going from 2020 into 2021, President Biden put the U.S. backing into the Paris Agreement, and we saw, a lot of positive momentum into the U.S. nuclear space. There were life extensions and credits made available, and the nuclear conversation started becoming much more mainstream. So back in 2018, you'd never see an article on nuclear. When you got to 2021, 2022, and today, I mean, there's almost an article on nuclear every single day. And it's in The Economist, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, mainstream media are now covering the space. So it's been a huge transformation in terms of momentum behind this particular space. And I think if you look at the time that we IPO'd back in 2018, we did an institutional-only offering. So we had no retail shareholders. Today, I've got something like 30% of my register is retail, which shows you how that story has broadened and become much more mainstream. So, Mobeen, a very long-winded answer to your question about my background and some of the history to Yellow Cake.
No, I love the journey and the backdrop and the story. And that brings us to your company now, Andre. And of course, I was looking on Yellow Cake PLC's website, and one statistic jumped out immediately. It said that Yellow Cake holds 21.68 million pounds of uranium oxide. And I think the word holds is quite important here because it reveals the business model of Yellow Cake PLC. Give us an overview, a quick introduction to what Yellow Cake PLC does, and where, in your view, the company sits within the broader uranium ecosystem. And of course, how significant is that 21.68 million pounds of uranium oxide?
Okay. Very simply, uranium Yellow Cake is a company that owns physical uranium, and we hold it for the long term. So, what we do is provide investors with an opportunity to track the uranium price through our share price. If you look at our balance sheet, we've got the 21.7 million pounds that you mentioned. Today's price, that's a little over $1.5 billion. We've got about $15 million of cash, and that's it. There's nothing else on our balance sheet, no debt, no hedges. So it's a, pure physically backed entity. When we IPO'd, as I mentioned, we bought our first uranium at $21. We took a view then that uranium's a commodity, commodities are cyclical, but we convinced ourselves we're at the bottom of the cycle or close to it, based on our supply-demand analysis. When we took the price at that time, half the world's production capacity would be underwater at that price. But a lot of these production sites were still running because they had historic long-term contracts, but those contracts were rolling off. So you got into a situation either where the price had to go up because customers wanted to pay more, or producers would shutter in capacity and reduce excess supply that way. So we're set up to buy and hold for the long term. We don't trade uranium. And the reason for that is, if I had a price point or traded around price point, guaranteed I'd be trading against my shareholders. A shareholder may buy our shares on the day that I sell some uranium. So we don't do that at all. We tend to, or we issue equity to buy more uranium, and we do that when we're trading at or above our net asset value. So we don't issue equity below net asset value. We've only got 2 full-time employees, myself and our CFO, Carol. We both work from home. Carol's based in Luxembourg. I'm here in London. We don't have an office. We've outsourced most of our transactional activity, so it's a very, very skinny structure. We target a total cost base of less than 1% of NAV, and I think in our last reporting period, we're about 0.8% of NAV. I don't believe we've ever been above the 1%. We've got this contract with Kazatomprom. We made the first purchase from them when we IPO'd, and that contract runs through till 2027, and it's an option arrangement where at our option, we can buy up to $100 million of uranium per annum, and we can do all of it, none of it, multiple tranches, and it's essentially at the spot price. So it's a fantastic contract for us. If we get to NAV or above, we can go and secure $100 million of uranium essentially at the spot price. And you've got a spot market that's very thin and illiquid and therefore volatile. So it's a good way to buy uranium without moving the price. The 21.7 million pounds that we own, just to put it in sort of the macro context, global production this year will be about 165 million pounds. Reactor burn will be about 180 million pounds. So our 22 odd million pounds is probably 15 odd % of needs. So it's significant, but it's not overwhelming. So yeah, that's the bit about Yellow Cake.
Thank you. It's fascinating to sort of learn more on this topic. One of the things that we look, and the people who come to WisdomTree's website around the world, one of the things they've seen recently is a lot of discussion about gold, related to how obviously everyone sees the price. It goes up 3,400, 3,500, 3,600 an ounce. And there's sort of this difference between the cost that the average miner sort of faces, depending on where they are, to get the gold out of the ground versus what you can sell the gold for, which is closer to the figure that we all see reported on the FT and all the various news sources. So I was wondering, is there a similar spread with uranium that inspires the mine? Because there's a lot of talk of the high gold price inspires companies like Newmont and Agnico and others to try to go get more gold, but they don't necessarily do it immediately, because if the price comes right back down, then that's not great. So there's a bit of a delay, but a higher price ultimately inspires sort of more exploration, maybe going after some of those more expensive deposits. But was just curious if you're seeing a similar dynamic with uranium miners these days.
Chris, that's a very good question. It's similar and it's different. It's similar in the sense that the uranium price, we're sort of in the incentive pricing regime now. Typically when supply and demand are more or less in balance, if you look at copper, for instance, typically you'd say, well, where does the supply curve hit the cost curve at, say, the 75th percentile, and that's typically where the price would trade. If the price trades down, capacity goes out of the market, it gets price support, and the price goes back up again. You see that very actively in iron ore. We've been sitting at that price around 100, and it goes up and down depending on where there's high cost volume that comes in and out of the market. In uranium right now, we're off that curve simply because there isn't enough supply to meet today's demand, and even less so if you look forward in the sort of short to medium term. If you go back to 2011, when we had the Fukushima event, pretty much since then, there's been no investment into exploration and new projects. And it just takes a very long time in this industry to find something, permit it, develop it, commission it, and get it up and running and producing. So, in a funny way, the uranium price could double tomorrow and you wouldn't see any new supply in the next 6 months, simply because the supply side doesn't have the capacity to respond. In the mining industry, supply will come. It always does, but it just takes time. So you've got a number of projects that greenfield projects that are out there, but I don't see any meaningful new supply coming on stream before the end of the decade. So today I mentioned we're consuming 180 million pounds of uranium through reactor burn. We're producing 165. The WNA last week came out with their new scenarios. I mean, they're talking about 390 million pounds of reactor needs by 2040. That's 16 years away. A typical mine life cycle from discovery to production is 16 years. So those are the lead times. And with this industry, the lead times on permitting are very, very long. They could be 4 or 5 years. So we're in this scenario now where, the supply side is really stretched. We've had a number of restarts announced. Quite a lot of them have had problems. Kazatomprom, which is Kazakhstan, is the world's largest producer of uranium. They came out with a reduced subsoil guidance. Cameco, a week before the WNA, so just over a week ago, came out and said they were lowering their guidance on their big mine for this year by 3 to 4 million pounds. In an industry that produces 165. So in the short to medium term, the story for me is a challenged supply side against an ever-increasing demand side. When we IPO'd in 2018, the demand growth forecasts were typically 1.5%. I think we're now seeing forecast, 4, 5, 6% demand growth. And it's, you mentioned, the data centers, the hyperscalers, but it's even much more fundamental than that. So in the US, there are 92 odd reactors, and the conventional wisdom 5 years ago was that these reactors would get to their end of life and they'd be shut in. But what we've seen is reactors that had 40 lives were given extensions to 60. Now they're talking about 80 years. So where this base was going to decline, and the US is the biggest consumer of uranium and nuclear power, or the biggest producer of nuclear power. So you've got a market that was going to be in decline that's now staying flat. But beyond that, we're now seeing restarts. So, Microsoft has done this 20-year deal on 3 Mile Island to restart 3 Mile Island 1. Palisades is being talked about as a restart. The reactor in California was given a life extension when it was almost shut. So you've got a base that was going to be in decline, then it's flat, and now you're actually seeing it increasing again. And then if you go east, China had, I think, 17 odd reactors at the time of Fukushima back in 2011. They're operating 56 reactors today, and they're building 26 as we speak. Last year they approved 10 additional reactors. They are building 8 to 10 reactors a year. They can do it in a 5 to 6 year timescale because they spent the last 10 years building out the supply chain. The people that can do the welding, the forging, all of that supply chain has been built up over a 10-year time frame. So, and then you get to the whole data center hyperscale, story. And really, ultimately that's a race to superintelligence between the US and China. So, President Trump's support for nuclear is not because he likes nuclear. It's ultimately, they want to win the AI race, and AI, machines just need huge amounts of data, huge amounts of power.
And so in looking at it, it feels like if someone is thinking, how is the world going to generate enough, quote unquote, electricity in the coming years to do all the stuff we want to do. Nuclear is one of the most important sources, the source gaining even more importance, and kind of the signposts that the investor might want to be looking at. And it's interesting that, you alluded to the decade type time scale, and that it's not something where you look at a signpost and you should immediately expect a reaction. It's a bit of a long term play, but you step back and you see the COP, 26, 27, 28, etc., talking more about nuclear. You see President Trump, the Trump administration, quadrupling nuclear capacity. I think it's by 2050 or some far out number in the future. Is it these government announcements, the announcements like what Meta and Microsoft and others do, is that sort of the key fundamental, where if you're continuing to see that positivity and commitment, that's what's going to push the space forward, regardless of any sort of noise that might happen in the interim?
Yeah, people often ask me what is the negative scenario. I mean, if you go back again, I mentioned 2020, 2021. We've seen enormous policy support for nuclear over the last 5 years. The 2040, 2050, 2060 carbon neutral commitments. A lot of countries that were exiting nuclear are now going back in. Belgium has repealed its law that they were going to exit nuclear. Denmark is looking at a change. The Netherlands is looking at changes. Even Germany, which had exited nuclear, has now conceded to Europe and the French that nuclear can be an acceptable technology. So you've had a lot of positive policy swing. And so, in some sense, the negative is the policy could go the other way. But I think we're in that swing now where I just don't see it going the other way anytime soon, because we started with kind of, energy transition and carbon neutrality. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it became energy security. If you're thinking about a country like Japan that imported all its LNG, all its gas and all its coal for its energy, it's got a nuclear fleet sitting there. And suddenly in that scenario, nuclear became much more important. I mean, just a small stat, a jelly bean of uranium has got the same energy content as a ton of coal. It's incredibly energy dense. So you can store, a lot of uranium in a very, very small space. Our uranium is stored in all uranium is stored in 55-gallon drums. And it's a 55-gallon drum. It's only filled 2/3 full because that weighs half a ton, because it's such a heavy, energy dense material. You could store, our uranium, 22 million pounds is probably half a football field, 3 stories high. It's dimensionally very, very small if you think about iron ore and coal, these big mountains. So from that point of view, energy security, you can store uranium for decades. It doesn't decay. It sits in a barrel. It doesn't, so you can have a decade's worth of uranium on a football size field, and it can supply your reactors, even for big countries. So it's got a lot of attractions. And so, you kind of got energy transition, energy security, the Russian invasion, and then the hyperscalers come along. For the likes of the Amazons, the Metas, electricity is an input for them. It's not an output. They need that input. They compete with their output. So, does Claude and ChatGPT compete? Absolutely. And so who is the most stable machine? Who do people go to for their searches? If you go into a search and the machine kicks out, you go somewhere else. So the competition on that side is so fierce. And these folk can't use wind and solar. I mean, these chips are so high spec. They need absolutely precise energy, and nuclear is the perfect solution for that. But I think, not to get too carried away, it's nuclear is a solution. It's not the only solution. I think in the West, we've seen failings because the West has forgotten how to build nuclear. I mentioned that China has now set up its program where it can build these reactors in 5 to 6 years on a constant budget basis. The West has forgotten to build big nuclear. The French in the 70s, the US in the 70s, the last time they built big nuclear. So we see, the Hinkley Point project in the UK. You talk about sizable, I don't know, 40, 50 billion. The two recent units in the US were over budget and over schedule. The unit in France, the same. So, there are people that say, well, this thing's going to cost too much. It's going to take too long. So, there is that dimension. But again, on the positive side, the South Koreans have just built 4 units for the UAE on time, on budget. So there are people who are doing this all the time, who know how to do it. I think where you're going to see a big swing is to small modular reactors. I think I'm a little skeptical on the West building big reactors. I'm very optimistic on the West building small modular reactors. These are downscaled versions of the bigger units. And you've got big companies. You've got Rolls-Royce in the UK, GE Hitachi, big companies and big countries building these small modulars. I mean, China's building its first one that'll be ready next year. Once they build one, they'll probably build 20. So I think, these things are going to be a game changer for nuclear, because if you're a data center guy, you can put the small modular reactor, the size of little more than a football field, next to your data center. So you just plug it in directly. You don't have to rely on long transmission lines, grid connectivity, all that sort of stuff. So, it's a very attractive technology, but it's not the only technology. And I think the world's going to need everything. If you look at China, for instance, they're building the most solar, the most wind, and the most nuclear. It's and they're still having to build coal to meet their energy needs.
It's interesting. Certainly, you mentioned small modular reactors. From an investment perspective, we've seen that some of the companies in this space have attracted a lot of market interest lately, those that are developing small modular reactors. So there's clearly a lot of excitement in the market, even though those modular reactors have not been installed yet, but the potential down the road could be very exciting. Of course, the fuel remains the same. We're still talking about uranium, although the technology, we're still talking about nuclear fission driving the technology, but the features might be somewhat different. Um, they talk about different safety features, different cooling features with these small modular reactors. But ultimately, in terms of the impact on the uranium market, from your perspective, it's still a positive addition, right? Because it's a new source of demand. So those demand numbers that you mentioned earlier in the years to come, I suppose this is another piece in that source of demand with small modular reactors. How do you see it?
No, absolutely. I think, there are folk that are saying that if you go out to 2050, small modulars will probably be 20% of the overall market. Firstly, just on small modular, there are, those that use conventional technology and conventional fuel. So just firstly, on the fuel cycle, the fuel, what we own is uranium oxide, U3O8. It's a yellow powder that sits, in these 55-gallon drums. That then gets converted into a gas, UF6. It gets put into a centrifuge process where you split out the 238 and the 235 isotope. You want the 235 isotope. Then you reconvert it back into a metal and into fuel rods and fuel bundles. So that whole process takes 18 to 24 months. So the working fuel cycle is very, very long. Conventional fuel machines, so your uranium oxide when it comes out of the ground is about 0.7% grade. It gets enriched to about 3.5 to 5% grade. And that's what goes into your conventional reactors. These advanced reactors, which use sodium cooling systems and other cooling systems, are looking at HALEU, which is the high assay fuel, and that is up to 20%. So the technology to do that, the only people who can do that today are the Russians. They've got the HALEU, they've got that conversion technology. So the issue for Western firms is, where do I get my fuel to fuel my new advanced reactor? And there are, there are technologies that are being developed and exploited in the West, but it's going to take a bit of time. So I think the winners, the initial winners in this space, are going to be those companies like Rolls-Royce that use the 3 to 5% fuel, standard reactor design and standard fuel and cooling. The advanced reactors will come, but I think they're going to be, probably 5 or 6 years later down the track, because they need the higher levels of fuels, which you build that capacity in the West before you can, fuel these machines. But in terms of the demand, it's interesting, because some of these reactors, you'll fuel it and you won't have to refuel it for 5 years. Your big reactors, you refuel every 18 months to 24 months. So you take out a third of the core, you put another third in, mix it up, and then it runs for another 18 to 24 months. Some of these small modular reactors could run for 5 years, or if you go down to smaller reactors, they could run for 15 to 20 years on a single fueling. So what that means for the supply side is your demand is much more front-end loaded. So, it hurts the supply side even more in a situation where in the near to medium term, we don't see enough supply coming to market. And when these guys come to market, they need all of their fuel on day one. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this plays out.
I was seeing on the website of Oklo, who are developing small modular reactors. They argue that 95% of uranium's potential energy is wasted on first use, and they were setting that up to make the case for recycling. And they said that we're using fully recycled uranium. What do you make of the importance of recycling? Can it be done? And where is the industry in terms of recycling uranium, and what lies ahead?
Yeah, it is very much in its infancy. There is some recycling that's done. I know some mixed oxide fuels go into Japanese reactors, but it's a very, very small component. It's not economic in today's scenario, dealing with the plutonium and all the various elements. It will, the technologies will advance. It's true, we do throw away a lot of the fuel that's unused. So, as you go forward, it is something that I think will become important. And you look at every industry, the stainless steel industry, the copper industry, you have recycling as a component. But in this industry, it's still very, very early days. And I think it's going to take time. I don't think you're going to see meaningful recycling in the next 10 years and maybe much longer. But it will come, and it should come.
Andre, I was curious about when you're talking about the different countries like Namibia and Australia and Kazakhstan and South Africa, where you have already found uranium. I was just thinking about sort of historically how certain technologies have driven us to sort of find different pockets, say, of oil and natural gas, where when Rockefeller is mining in 1870s, 80s, 1890s, etc., more than 100 years ago, you're finding certain deposits of oil that can more easily be found with the technology available at the time. And then you fast forward to today, and we've got fracking, and the U.S. supply is unbelievable. I remember during the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s, the U.S. was depending on almost all the oil coming from the Middle East. So you see how, at least with oil as an example, where you thought it was, shifts and changes based on the technology available. So I was just wondering, A, what technology allows them to find uranium, and B, is there a chance that there are these large deposits, say, deeper down, that we're maybe not as aware of today, or other things where 5-10 years from now we could be talking about different countries having dramatic uranium reserves?
Yeah, I think, Chris, there are two components there. There's the technology to find and the technology to process. So, my experience in copper, it's the finding yes, the technology's developed, use aero mags and all different. It improved, but I think the big kick came from the technology to process. So, where you could economically mine 2% copper 30 years ago, now they're economically mining 0.4 or even down to 0.2% copper. A, because the price has gone up, but B, you now get a 300-ton truck. You don't have to have a 60-ton truck. So the scale economics, have made processing much, much cheaper. And in a sense, you could argue that shale was yes, the unlocked technology was this, drilling, but it also it was kind of a processing technology. It freed up a resource that people kind of knew about, but they could never access it, economically without a technology shift. In uranium, I think it's reasonably well understood where the deposits are. Kazakhstan being the biggest, Canada second largest. Australia is actually the largest resource base, but it's in a single mine, the Olympic Dam mine, which is a copper mine owned by BHP. That's now the uranium's just a byproduct. But I think over time, processing technologies should bring, allow access. But it's driven by where the price is. There's uranium in seawater, but it's just not economic to extract. If the price was $1,000, maybe it is economic to extract in out of seawater. So I think you get supply responses based on where the price goes. If the price is high enough, people find very innovative ways of bringing new supply to market. I guess on the oil, your shale oil side, there was days where I think a time when Goldman Sachs was forecasting $150 oil or plus. And when you see oil at 120, there's a supply response because people are innovative with technology. So, I don't think I think on the uranium side, we more or less know where the deposits are. It's just how to access them economically and where the price is. Does the price, today I would argue the long-term price is $80. There are 2 projects in Namibia that can be constructed in the next 3 to 4 years. Neither of them have made investment decisions because in their view, $80 is not high enough to incent new production. So we need to see a price that is attractive enough. I think that price is probably $90, $100 plus to get new capacity. And then it's going to take 4 years for that capacity to come. But ultimately, as a former BHP CEO said, technology always wins. In the long run, technology wins. So we'll find ways of extracting uranium or any other commodity, but it's based on where the price is and the economics of extraction.
So something else for our audience, one of the nice things about going to Yellow Cake's website is it's almost like on a monthly basis you get the thoughts from the CEO, very very conversational in tone, very digestible. And one of the things I decided I wanted to make sure to ask in this conversation, Andre, was any sort of contrast, because I think one of the notes referred to a similar gathering on the nuclear topic occurring over the summer in the DC area, and then you were indicating there was the bigger event or one of the biggest events of the year in the London area. So as you're sort of traveling the world and comparing and contrasting in your mind, you got different type of participants in different countries. Is the feel at all these events basically unequivocally positive in 2025, or when you're in different countries, are they focused on different things or the same things? As you kind of do the world tour of nuclear, I'm just wondering if it's just positive across the West, or if you're picking up on nuances and differences.
I think it is. I mean, firstly, we're a very small industry. I think if you add up the market capitalization of all the listed companies in this space, it's probably like 50 billion. Larry Ellison said the entry ticket to the data center game is $100 billion. That's,
Yes.
the US guys are spending $330 billion on data centers this year alone. So it's a relatively small industry. There I think 5 or 6 producers produce almost 80% of the world's uranium. So it is a small industry, and I think certainly in terms of sentiment, we've just had as you mentioned, the World Nuclear Association meetings in London last week. It was their 50th anniversary, and it was the biggest event that they had. I think they had something close to 1,200 people. I remember my first event in 2018, it was less than 100 people, so there's a lot more enthusiasm, about where it's, the demand side, both for energy transition and now for energy into AI. And the understanding that supply is difficult. As the CEO of Cameco said, mining is difficult. It takes a long time. It's hard to produce. You've got weather events, you've got strikes and things that you have to deal with. These are not industrial facilities built in, outside of London or wherever, where it's easy to get inputs. You turn a switch and the machines hum. Mining is still very, is still labor intensive in the sense of all the bits and pieces you have to do. But I think there was certainly this WNA, and in the run up to the meetings we had, there are a number of guys who've restarted historically shuttered operations, and quite a few of them have had hiccups. Kazatomprom guided down on where they think they're going to be. Cameco the week before WNA announced that £3 to £4 million miss on this year on one of their big mines. So going into the WNA, people understood that the supply side is challenged, and there's a lot of excitement around the demand side. So I would say this was a very, very positive event. And I've done a number of investor events recently, and I get almost no pushback on the story. You're not like, oh, you're wrong, you've missed this and that. Everyone says to me, I get the thesis. I understand the supply demand. What is the timing? What's going to be the catalyst, and when's it going to happen? Is it going to be this week, next month, next quarter? If you're a fund, it matters if you're sitting on a dead trade for 6 months. Whereas for me, I take a 3 to 5 year view. It's fundamentally positive. I don't have to trade the very, very short term. So, that's where kind of my perspective and the perspective of my investors differ a little, is their timeframes are different to mine. But so it's not about the thesis. It's about what is the catalyst and when.
It's very interesting, and certainly we share your observation in the sense that investors are endorsing the story and buying into the story of the structural case for nuclear. Some people say that historically nuclear has had a brand problem, and it's been a problem that maybe the industry is now addressing, and that there's a new brand image emerging, that nuclear is that sustainable source of energy that the world needs as we add into our energy demand. But one of the things that's caused that brand problem, Andre, is the question of waste. Now, a lot of people say that when they think about nuclear energy, they think about nuclear waste and its potential damage to the environment, even though when you hear people from the industry talk about nuclear waste, they say that it's a technical problem that's in large part been overcome. Like that there are ways to handle nuclear waste and not let it impact the environment. There are ways to store it safely, or like you said, recycling is emerging as well. What do you see as being the state of the nuclear waste topic, and is it something that people should be concerned about, or is that something maybe where we'll see more developments in the years to come?
I don't want to dismiss the issue, but just want to put it in a dimensional context. If you take all the nuclear waste that has been generated since the commercial reactor program started in the 1950s, again, I think it's like the size of a few football fields, 5 stories high. So if when people think about waste, you think of you think about, the sort of waste dumps of in the conventional mining sense of waste. It's dimensionally very, very small. And today, the waste is all stored at the reactor site. It's encased. Um, they're talking about deep storage. Finland, I think, are opening their first deep storage facility where you put it a kilometer underground in very competent material, concrete encased. Again, if you think about the scale of what you have to deal with, it's solvable. It'll be solved through storage. It'll be solved through technology and recycling over time. It's just, you shouldn't get excited or concerned about mountains of waste sitting around. It just isn't like that. So it is a sensitive topic. And back to your comment about brand, I think the nuclear industry hasn't been very good at promoting itself in the past. It tends to be defensive. In the nuclear industry last year, there were no deaths. In the coal industry, there are 10,000 deaths. That's not a positive brand image, in a sense. You're trying to send a positive image, but you're using a negative connotation. So I think the industry hasn't helped itself. In a funny way, when the Amazons, the Facebooks, and the Googles get involved, you get brand rub-off. If it's okay for those guys, it's okay for nuclear. So I think there's an opportunity for the industry. It has been working hard recently to change the brand and move the debate forward. But there is an opportunity now to maybe take that forward in a more meaningful way.
Andre, it's a new topic for us at Wisdom Tree, and we're certainly learning about uranium and nuclear energy. And I was recently doing a webinar, and someone asked me about thorium, and I have to confess I had no idea, because I had not studied what thorium market dynamics are. And I said that I will look into it. That was my promise in response to that question live on that webinar. But now that we have the opportunity to speak to you, I'm curious if you have views. When we think about nuclear, we always think uranium, but are there alternative fuels out there that maybe we should be paying attention to and could become worthy competitors to uranium?
Yeah. Again, yes, but not in my lifetime. I would say, people have spoken about thorium for a very long time. It is kind of the holy grail, but your reactor today doesn't work. You have to, the whole licensing of these things has to be, redone. So it's something that, I know the Chinese are spending, a lot of effort on the thorium side. Then you go from fission to fusion, that's the other holy grail. I think these things all have a place, but, if I take a 10 to 20-year time horizon, I don't see any of those things impacting our market in that time horizon. Maybe if you go out 30, 40 years, it'll be there. But, so I don't want to dismiss it. I'm just not seeing it in the next 2 decades in any meaningful way.
Andre, I was wondering about something, because there is obviously, geopolitically speaking, a lot of tension in the world today. The idea of, quote unquote, working with Russia on an initiative is not the easiest idea to stomach. The idea of working with China on an initiative, again, not the easiest of ideas. But you do get the impression that, at least with our current administration in the U.S., negotiator in chief might be the current branding that the president wants to convey in certain forums. I was just wondering, like, for instance, you alluded to the HAL EU, this sort of high assay, low enrichment, being currently in Russia, China, obviously doing a lot of things. Do you ever have the opportunity to visit these sort of off the beaten path places on, quote unquote, the other side of the field? From a perspective, merely, you alluded the industry is not that big, but all these countries are doing interesting things. I feel like, in theory, we can learn from what they're all doing. And do they have events that you can go to, be it in China or in Russia, where people get together and it's sort of putting the geopolitics aside, trying to learn from what they're doing, or is that just not possible?
partly not possible, and partly, I don't think you gain a lot. It's simply in one sense. So, I talked about the Russia and the HALEU, but if you look at the fuel cycle, so uranium conversion and enrichment, Russia's got about 10% of the world's uranium, but it's got like 30% of the world's conversion and 45% of the world's enrichment. So even today, over 20% of the enriched fuel into the US comes from Russia, and into Europe, it's north of 20%. So everything's sanctioned except nuclear fuel. Now, enrichment and conversion, they're industrial processes. Yes, they're high tech, high spec, but Orano, Urenco in the West do the stuff. It's just going to take time to build Western capacity. The Russians always supplied, they were the most reliable and the cheapest fuel. So, the West kind of got addicted to cheap Russian fuel. And then with the invasion, they have to kind of, wean themselves off of that. And it's going to take time. I mean, first, the US have banned Russian fuel from the beginning of 2028. So, it's not like the resource. It's not like it's, you can only find uranium in certain places. Those processes you can build, and the technology is available. It just takes time. I mean, Russia has got a big export reactor program. So if you look at the export reactor program, I think Russia has got something like 65% of it. So they're building reactors in China, India, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt. So that conversion and enrichment feeds their whole reactor program, the export program, because they supply the fuel, they take away the waste, they do all of that. So, yeah, I don't think, there's much. I don't think you would gain a huge amount because, the information is available on how much resource they have, what conversion they've got, and what enrichment they've got. We've seen Urenco and Orano both announce enrichment capacity increases, but no one has yet announced any, capacity increases on the conversion side. So, there's a choke point or a bottleneck there, but it'll get solved.
And Andre, I think one of the best points that you made over the course of this discussion is sort of this idea of thinking on the right timeline. I feel like ChatGPT in our thematic world of investing, where you have something that doesn't exist one moment, it exists in the next moment. 2 months later, 100 million people are using it. Now on a monthly basis, maybe there's 100 million more people using it. So in a sense, we get spoiled by software in our current world. A couple clicks on the supercomputer in your pocket, boom, you're using something that you weren't using 30 seconds prior. And everything that we've talked about today in nuclear is a decision might get made, and the result of that decision could take 2 years, 18 months, 4 years. It's always years, or at minimum months.
Yeah,
It's not
multiple years.
yeah, it's not like, and one of the focal points that the administration in the US is bringing out is sort of now some parts of the process, I'm sure, are the technology, and to do things safely just takes a certain amount of time. And certain things are slow, not because the technology itself and a lot of stuff is like this, not just nuclear, but the permitting that needs to occur takes, and the bureaucracy that you have to get through. And I know on the US side, they're talking about taking away at least some of that. I'll be amazed if I don't think it's a solvable thing fully in 4 years with one administration, but maybe you can get a few things through. With my final question of this discussion, I'd love to hear your sort of informed take on, the dismantling, or at least the attempted dismantling, of the regulatory bureaucracy in the United States, and whether or not you're seeing at least green shoots of initial success with that.
Oh. I'm not sure I'm qualified to respond to that
Oh,
to
who
that
is
question.
qualified?
Yeah, but I think that the permitting is only one side of it. People forget how long it takes to go from exploration, even to before you get to permitting. When you find a resource, You have to dimension it, do all the studies. By the time you have a resource that you can package up to put into a permitting process, that can take you 10 years. So, if you think that, I think the average, I saw a study where it says the average of discovery to mine is 16 years in our industry, in the mining industry. 16 years. You can't blame 16 years on permitting. Maybe it's five years, but sending someone into the field with a drill to go and explore, and find the right thing, and then do dimensioning, say this is of sufficient scale to be economic. It takes a long, long time, and that's the part that again, from my BHP days, when I was involved, I think we signed up in Saskatchewan. They've got the Jansen project. I think we signed that deal in 2007. They're now still building phase one. We're in 2025. And that's the world's largest mining company who knows how to do things. It just takes a long time.
Fascinating. And it's certainly a fascinating topic. And we thank you, Andre, for joining us and sharing your informed insights. I'm sure the users, the listeners, and the audience will find it equally interesting. Thank you very much. You were listening and watching Andre Liebenberg, Yellow Cake's CEO, talking all about uranium and the nuclear industry. Before we close, I do need to state the following. To clarify, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree, and in this episode, Yellow Cake PLC, and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Next Big Thing. If you want to hear more from us, please subscribe on whichever platform you're using. And of course, you can follow us on LinkedIn or X, Wisdom Tree in Europe. And of course, if you want to hear more about megatrends, visit Wisdom Tree's website. And of course, if you want to learn more about uranium, visit the website of Yellow Cake PLC, where you can hear more from Andre himself. And we thank everyone for watching and listening. We will see you all next time.